co-CEO of the Fair Education Alliance. It is an absolute pleasure to be here for this session. The Secretariat got to choose which sessions we wanted to help out for in the majority of circumstances, and this was one of the first ones that I put down because it is such an important one about how you use this tool in the variety of purposes that it has, with the honesty and transparency and also the reflective practice that it can bring. So I think we're going to have an amazing discussion today and learn a lot from Julian as well. So just before I hand over, really quickly about the Alliance. We, of course, are all here with that shared vision that no child's educational success is limited by their socioeconomic background. And for those of you who are in the room who are members, part of our 230 member organization Strong Alliance, welcome. I hope that you have been enjoying the Impact Festival so far. And welcome to any early stage innovators that are also joining this afternoon to get a better understanding of the different tensions to manage when going through evaluation. So we have 2 awards that are open right now. So for FEA members, we have our Entrepreneurship Award, and for the public, we have our Innovation Award. So if you are interested, both of these are open for another 3.5 weeks. They close on the 18th of May, and both awards give each have up to 5 winners. They give a year of support. They give £15,000 salary for you to put towards your salary. So that, pardon me, £15,000 contribution that you can put towards your salary so that you can go full time on developing your idea to make education fair. So we have various sessions coming up on Wednesday and tomorrow, Wednesday and Thursday on these. So do have a look and hopefully you can take part. So what I will say is that there are nearly 30 of us in the room, fantastic. And what we'd love to see is the impact of this go even further. Impact and evaluation at the heart of organization strategy is critical to achieving a fair education. So do feel free to share on social media, which is #ImpactFestival. And we've got the tags and handles for Villiers Park on Julian's slides coming up as well. And then also just have a look at the rest of the sessions. We have 17 more sessions happening across tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday. So there are now session descriptions in our timetable, and you can check that out in the link in the chat. So we're going to kick off with discussing your input about evaluation. So what I would love you to discuss with some peers in a moment is the question, what is the best thing that you have ever learned from research or evaluation outcomes? And this can be your own, or it can be somebody else's. So this is a question from Julian, so he can get a flavor of who's in the room. So we're breaking you out into small groups of about 3 individuals, and we'll just have really quick 5 minutes for you to share your name and organization, and then start discussing about what is the best lesson learned that you've got from evaluation or research. So then we'll come back, hear from Julian, and have him take us away. So Ellie, would you mind breaking us out, please? Great, welcome back. Fantastic conversations. As you're joining, just ping in the chat what the best thing that you learned was, so we can do a bit of a hive mind on that and learn from you. So it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Julian to share from Villiers Park Educational Trust. The tightrope that he's been walking. He is a self-proclaimed lover of all things evaluation. So all of you in the room are in great hands, I should say, today with Julian leading this and his absolute passion for this and what it can share. So Julian, if I have you come on, I'll spotlight you for everyone.
That's great. Thanks very much. I'm just going to call my screen up. Yeah, well, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation to come and talk today, and B, for everyone else for making time out of your busy schedules to come and kind of join in the kind of workshop and discussion. I'm the Chief Programs Officer at Villiers Park Educational Trust. Just had a really interesting discussion in the breakout room about some of the different organisations that you represent, and probably like many of you, we're a charity that work with disadvantaged young people between years 9 and 13, and we our goal is to help them to think about their values and purpose, and to identify the future that they want and is most meaningful to them, and then to support them to have that, to achieve that goal and ambition. So obviously for a lot of young people we work with, it is around progression to higher education, and that's kind of, I guess that's my background in that I used to work at university, Sheffield University, managing a research and evaluation unit that was focused on outreach and widening participation with young people. So I've done that for, started about 2012, so seen quite a few changes in the sector, and it's been really interesting moving into the third sector to sort of see how evaluation is different and the different kinds of pressures and objectives. So I think we've done all the housekeeping. So yeah, thanks very much for leaving your cameras on. It's always really nice to see actual faces. And yeah, as Gina said, please comment, question using the chat function. And if at any point you want to stop me and ask something, please just raise your hand, and I'm very happy to respond to stuff as it happens. I've come from an HE wide participation and outreach background, now working with the charity to help develop its programs and to build an evaluation framework. And it struck me over the last few years of working in evaluation that as evaluators, we're kind of dancing to two different tunes, and we're kind of quite often trying to answer two different sets of questions, sometimes with the same evaluation approach. And I've kind of started to struggle with that, and I've started to wonder how possible that is, and whether we need to be more explicit about who we're evaluating for and what they might want to see out of the evaluation, and therefore how we change our evaluation approach. So the kind of the tightrope image sort of came to mind, and sorry for anyone that suffers from vertigo. I tried to not make it too steep a drop. So the key question I think that animates both stakeholder groups is the question of what works, and that's so I'm just going to move this. I think that is a kind of really good kind of framing question, but it does have different meanings according to who's asking it. So in the two groups that I'm focusing on in this session, I'm thinking in terms of, I've said managers, senior leadership, policymakers, trustee groups, any kind of high level decision makers. When they ask what works, it will mean something different than when we ask ourselves what works. So I've done a quick table of what I think the question means for the different groups. So in terms of managers and policymakers, when they say what works, it's quite often driven by a kind of value for money or return on investment perspective. So they kind of want to know what works so that they can allocate resources effectively. Whereas I think for practitioners and delivery staff and colleagues, it's as much about how do we improve our practice and therefore our impact. So there's a different focus there. The kind of outputs or outcomes that we derive from our evaluation will also change. So my kind of, and again, it's quite a crude binary, but it's just to kind of be able to talk about it. So in my head, I'm thinking, managers and policymakers seem to be much more interested in measurable impacts. So they tend towards quantitative data. Whereas for those of us at the coalface working with young people or in an educational context, we tend to have a much broader view of outcomes, and that can include qualities data and other forms of understanding about what's actually happening. I think managers and policymakers will be much more interested in a clear narrative that helps them make decisions. So it tends to be quite abstracted, quite the more we can strip away the grey areas and give them a clear steer on decision making, the better. Whereas for practitioners, I think it's as much about understanding the intervention and the young people or the older people we're working with. So I think managers and policymakers are kind of, they want the simplest possible narrative that will help steer their decision making. Whereas for those of us that kind of work in this context, the narrative gets more and more complex the more we do and the more we see. So managers might value that kind of high level abstraction and the high level perspective, whereas we will tend to see the detail, and we'll tend to see interventions as broken down into small steps, and I'll come back to that a bit later. The focus for managers will tend to be on kind of outcomes and outputs and impact, whereas for practitioners it's about practice, and that's the ultimate the end point, I think. So, and this is a, you know, I've chanced my arm a bit with this opposition, but I'm suggesting that managers and policymakers might be more interested in logic models, whereas practitioners, we might be more interested in theories of change. And theories of change are my real love, and I will be waxing lyrical about them later, so you are warned. But theories of change seem to me a really good tool for helping practitioners use evaluation to keep improving outcomes and impacts. So I thought I'd just take the two different stakeholder groups and work through that table in a bit more detail. So first of all, looking at managers and policymakers, I'm really sorry about the slightly gender bias in some of the illustrations. I did spend quite a lot of time looking for a better icon that was either gender neutral or female, but I couldn't find one, so unfortunately. So please excuse that. But first one, we'll look at the managers and policymakers. So as I said, you know, one of the first kind of interest they may have is in terms of value for money and return on investment. And it's had quite an interesting chat in the breakout room with Maria from the Teacher Development Fund, who is busy evaluating the impact of teacher professional development. And when I've looked at that kind of evaluation of professional development and training outcomes, I started to see that it's actually probably a lot more complicated than it would seem on first glance. So the kind of input bit's quite easy because that's money, you know, whether that's direct money or money as resources and the spend and the, you know, rents and things. So that can be calculated. Just normally a very clear input figure that goes in. And the problem is when you start to look at the return value of the kind of interventions that many of us do, fair education interventions, what we're seeing is it's really hard to then quantify those outcomes. So we've got outcomes that might be delayed. So in my work with universities, universities might work with young people, you know, in year 7, and their progression to HE is going to be several years away. So you've got a very delayed outcome if that's the outcome you're looking for. There tends to be much more, you know, the kind of changes that we might want to see are better represented qualitatively because they may be different for each individual young person we work with. The impact might be things we can't anticipate or even measure. And we might be talking about outcomes and impacts that are cumulative. So we might be interested in a chain of outcomes that links education outcomes eventually with career outcomes. And for those of us that have worked in the HE space, obviously there's a source of frustration in that often in policy, quality degrees are measured solely by the income of students that graduate, and that's a kind of seems to be quite a reductive way of measuring the impact of HE study. And also the kinds of impacts and outcomes that can stem from fair education interventions will appear at a range of levels. So it might be an individual impact, or it could be a much broader social impact and a social good, it could be a change within an organisation. So it's much harder to try and quantify those kind of outcomes into things that balance the quantitative equation for managers. So as I said, you know, managers and policymakers and trustees tend to be more interested in quantitative measures. So quantitative measures are easier to fit into a kind of simple narrative. So in the kind of areas I've worked in, managers or senior leaders have wanted to use evaluation data primarily to inform decision making, whether that's around spend or resourcing or emphasis on activities. So they particularly value data that enables them to make comparisons, you know, and to benchmark, compare with peers and competitors, to map decreases or increases in quantitative values, and will enable what is often a complex situation to be abstracted into something that can be represented in a graph or a chart. And in the kind of HE context, I learned fairly early on that the kind of evaluation outcomes that we wanted to represent had to be, you know, if it went over more than like 2 sides of A4, it probably would be ignored. And so it's that kind of, you know, how do we make this into a nice, clear message for someone to be able to use in their decision making. The other element I think that can often come into a managerial approach to evaluation is, and we often see this if for those of us who've worked in the HE sector, the Office for Students, for example, would position evaluation as a way of identifying and sharing best practice. And that's quite often what we see, you know, we'll identify the things that work best, and then everyone will do that, and then everything will be brilliant. And that's always struck me as quite an interesting approach, because it ignores or it kind of makes an assumption that interventions are generalizable, and that if you do something in one context, you can just transfer it to another context and it will be equally as effective. And that seemed to me particularly to be the approach to widening participation for higher education for a while, in the sense that, you know, if we can just identify the type of activity that works, everyone does it, and we'll solve the problem. And of course, all the different contexts that you might want to do this work are completely different, and you know, you can't guarantee that it will work with different groups of students or in different contexts. So managers are quite keen on adopting a high level outcome, and they have to in order to be able to make decisions. So, you know, they kind of take that helicopter view, so they can see the big picture. So the kind of things they might be interested in the kind of work that we've done or I've done in the past is educational outcomes. You know, how does that change over time? How does it compare with different parts of the sector? They might be interested in progression rates. And of course, we see these kind of high level outcomes mapped across the performance indicators for schools. So the proportion of young people progressing to university or apprenticeships or so on. So it's a very high level, kind of quite abstracted picture of what's actually going on. So I guess it does seem in some cases that what we've actually got is quite a significant reduction of complexity in the interests of a kind of simpler narrative. So from a kind of senior stakeholder or a manager's position, what we kind of, I guess the steer we tend to get is that the evaluation they would like needs to be robust and reliable. So it needs to be, they need to be able to rely on it to make effective decisions. It needs to provide clear and consistent outcome measures. I don't know how many of us here have attempted to feedback on evaluation outcomes that didn't have a clear outcome. You know, if there's an ambiguity or a less clear outcome, sometimes that gets bounced back and someone says, well, we just need to know, you know. And, you know, as I said, it's kind of data that enables managers to make comparisons and benchmark and position the outcomes against other values. And it needs to be comprehensible and easy to summarise, that kind of one size of A4, preferably as a chart or diagram, that is, you know, can be accommodated and assimilated into decision making. I'm aware at this point that I probably have set this up as a slightly straw person target, in that I'm perhaps doing a disservice, but that sort of seems to be the kind of trend of the way that this approach works. So for these kind of reasons, decision makers, policy makers tend to draw on a kind of logic model approach to evaluation. It's a kind of quite a long established model, and if you're ever bored, I can recommend doing a Google image search for logic models, because there's a whole variety of different formats, and some of them are things of beauty, but the sort of essential structure is this kind of process map between inputs, what the resources and finances you put in, what are the activities you deliver on the basis of those resources, what are the outputs from your activities, and what are the outcomes of the outputs. So the activity is the thing that you build using resources, and the output is the thing that goes into the world, whether that's an activity or a set of resources or web, online resources. And then those outputs should lead to outcomes and kind of as we've developed, we tend to think in terms of outcomes at different stages. So we've got the short-term outcomes, medium and long-term outcomes, and then ultimately to the impact of the kind of inputs. So it's a nice, clear process way of thinking about the work we do. It helps kind of bring the different strands of an activity or intervention together, and it's kind of easily assimilable. It's it's easy to kind of take in at a glance. So that's my slightly crude construction of the managerial senior stakeholder view of evaluation. You may have guessed my heart really lies on the other side of the balance. So it's the role that evaluation can play for practitioners, and that's the stuff that I get really excited about, if I'm honest. So the key thing, I think, or one of the key interests that practitioners, that we have as practitioners, is that evaluation is a thinking process that enables us to think about our practice and our outcomes and our activities. And it enables us to think about how we can increase our impact and outcomes. So it's not just capturing and representing them, it's actually a way of creatively thinking about what we can do better, what we can do differently, how we can make our practice more effective, what specifically is it that we do that leads to the outcomes we want. So in my world, what that means is cracking open the logic model that the managers use. So you've got the kind of the structure, and I think this kind of evaluation forces us to ask the how questions. And the two kind of key points of intervention really are the gap between activities and outputs. So how does what we design as an activity create the output? But more importantly, how does what we do lead to the outcomes? What is it specifically that we do in our activities or interventions that creates the outcome that we want to see? And I've always been struck by the way that logic models kind of gloss over that, whereas that to me is the magic. That's the stuff that makes the difference. The other thing that we might, sort of building on that idea, the other thing that we might want to think about more is the small steps approach. And I meant to put a reference down to Neil Harrison and Richard Waller's brilliant paper, which is evaluate. I can't remember the title. If you search evaluation and small steps, then you'll find the paper, and it's one of the best and most influential papers for me that I've read, because it was written for widening participation to HE evaluation, when what tended to happen is that we were asked to assess the impact of activities on the end goal, which was we want, the country and the sector want more disadvantaged young people to progress into higher education. So that was the kind of the unit of measurement, and that was the success factor. And I've kind of, on this diagram, I've kind of got the managerial perspective here, which is, their evaluation approach looks at, what's the relationship between an intervention and this outcome, which is progression into university. Whereas for practitioners, what we're much better at seeing is that eventual outcome at this end of the chain is actually comprised of a number of smaller steps and smaller incremental developments for young people that contribute to a cumulative outcome, which is the outcome or impact we want. And what we've actually got a number of small interventions that might address specific things. So one of the kind of in terms of progression to higher education, one of the kind of strands of work focuses on attainment raising. So it's how do we work with young people to ensure that they get the grades they need in their level 3 qualifications to progress into higher education. And in the first step, that might involve making young people aware of the benefits of higher education, the relevance to them, to increase their motivation to study. We might want to work with them to develop specific academic skills that will help them in their qualifications. We might want to work with them in terms of subject specific knowledge that will support a particular qualification. We might want to give them specific skills that will help them in their examination, so revision skills or study skills and so on. And all these things will contribute to the point at which the young person gets the grades they need, and then we get to the final impact. But it's a process that can go through many steps. It can take a long time, and rather than just evaluating this kind of huge leap here, what we might want to evaluate are the much smaller steps. So we might want to evaluate how effectively are we giving young people academic skills that will lead to better level 3 outcomes. And then we can start bringing all these different small steps together into a bigger pathway. So the other sort of characteristic of evaluation from practitioner perspective is that we're probably interested in different kinds of evidence as well. So we might be interested in evaluation outcomes that are qualitative, so you know, mixed method approaches with focus groups, interviews, reflexive journals, creative, you know, art evaluation through artwork. We're probably more interested in evaluation outcomes that tell a complex picture, so that will unpick our activities into series of small interlocking steps. And we might be interested in evidence that is perhaps partial or cumulative. And we might accept that we're not, you know, maybe not able to demonstrate a kind of completely robust 100% causal relationship between what we've done and a particular set of outcomes. But what we will be able to do is strengthen our confidence in what we do as a kind of factor in the kind of outcomes we're looking. And the other kind of aspect that I think we're more likely to be interested in the managers is the kind of acknowledging all the other contextual factors and the other things that can feed into the outcome for young people. So we might be more interested in the school context of a young person we work with. We might be interested in their family context or all of those things. And we recognise that the pathway to where we want to get to has a lot of different contributory factors as well. So we try and allow for those. Which brings me on to I guess, the secret subtext of my talk, and it's just trying to share my enthusiasm for theory of change approaches and to sort of talk about a bit why I've found it so valuable and why it's the go-to thing for me. And I can't see many of you, so I don't know how embedded theory of change work is in what you do. And as with logic models, there's a million different ways you can take it. And I'll talk you through the model that we use at Villiers Park, and which we've used in one anticipation evaluation as well. But a theory of change is a completely flexible kind of instrument, and it can reflect what you want. But generally, it's a way of thinking through the evaluation process in a way that it is open to and acknowledges the complexity of what we do and the environments that young people might be in. It allows us to focus on our assumptions and our inferences as much as a kind of, you know, robust conclusion or evidence. And I think the key thing, and that the reason that I really am really invested in theory of change, is that they acknowledge the professional wisdom of practitioners and people that work with young people. And I think what I used to see in the HE outreach sphere was a kind of, you know, there was a lot of really good research and evaluation done by academics, which is great, but quite often what got missed was the professional expertise that comes from working with young people over a long period, and that kind of quality observation, the professional wisdom and the tacit knowledge that you accumulate about what works. And I wasn't seeing that represented very often. So theory of change seems like a really good way of capturing that. And it's also a really good way to be able to have space to think about your practice and to reflect on what you do in a way that kind of a managerial approach to evaluation may not allow. So this is the kind of the model of the theory of change that we use at Villiers Park, and it goes through kind of 5 key stages. And what we tend to do is we would sit down as a group and we just kind of brainstorm, and we just, you know, we try and get everything out of everyone's head onto a sheet of paper or a virtual whiteboard, so that we can start looking at the kind of patterns and trends. And the starting point really is, so what we do is in response to an issue or a challenge or a problem. So the first thing we do is sketch out and explore the nature of that issue and the problem. And alongside this kind of descriptive way through the narrative is a constant questioning of how we know stuff. So it's, you know, what's the issue or problem? And then we say, well, how do we know that's a problem? What's our evidence for this is a problem? What are the characteristics of the problem? What do we see the problem? What do we know from our work with young people about this problem? And that enables us to kind of map out the problem in a quite a complex way. And then we can see much more clearly about how our activities or interventions plug into different aspects of the issue or problem. So once we've kind of sketched out the problem, we can then look at what we do to solve the problem or to resolve it. And you can use this approach to either develop an evaluation plan for things you're already doing, or you can use it to design new interventions and activities. Because once you've got your problem kind of issues sketched out in its complexity, you can then start deciding which particular elements of the problem you want to tackle through your activity. But if we've got a set of interventions or a program or an activity that's designed to address the issue, we talk about, okay, so what do we actually do then? You know, in the broader sense, how are we responding to that issue? How do we know that this is the right thing to do? What's the evidence that this will work to address the problem? So it's kind of quite a high level of, you know, looking at the activities. And then the next step, I think, is the really exciting bit for me, because we start talking about active ingredients, and it's the detail within the activity or intervention that makes the difference for the young people we work with. So what is it specifically we do? What are the mechanisms? What are the kind of the things we deliberately do because we know they will be the small things that make the difference? It might come blank, I can't think of a good example, but it will be something, you know, a specific way. You might set a room up in a particular way to encourage conversation between young people, to encourage networking, to encourage interaction with different ideas. That would be an active ingredient. So it's not just a workshop, it's a workshop that's been designed in a different way. And again, it's, you know, how do we know that these are the right active ingredients? How do we know they work? What are we drawing on, whether it's our own experience and observation, or whether it's external evidence? So once you've kind of mapped out this view of your activity, and you've got a clear picture of how it relates to your issue and problem, we can start thinking about how we want to evaluate it. And the kind of, okay, given the fact that in our activity and intervention we know we're doing this, these are active ingredients which we hope will do this, we can come up with a set of success statements. So we know that if these active ingredients and the mechanisms work, then this will be the outcome for young people. So we can describe what success looks like. And once we've done that, we've got the other challenging bit of evaluation, which is, okay, we know what success looks like. What kind of measures can we use to measure that success? And again, how do we know that those are accurate and valid measures of what we're doing? And I think this kind of approach was developed from having been involved in evaluation of some university outreach, and seeing that people were kind of plucking what I sort of came to think of as convenience measures. So they were thinking, oh, you know, we can get this data, that we'll use that as an evaluation measure. And when you started asking, you know, well, how does that relate to what you've actually done? Quite often there wasn't a very strong link, which meant that it wasn't a causal reflection of what they were doing. So it's trying to encourage a sort of the development of much more carefully calibrated evaluation measures that actually reflect the active ingredients. And sorry, this is a really, it's probably way too much, you know, way too complicated for now, but in the middle I've got the kind of stages that I've just talked about, but I've also shown the kind of how we bookend the evaluation process. So the first thing is we start off with thinking about who we're evaluating for. What do those evaluation stakeholders, whether it's managers or stakeholders, whether it's ourselves as practitioners, whether it's a regulatory body, our trustee board, what do they want from this evaluation process? What are they expecting to see? What kind of things do they want to use? You know, if it's for decision making, what do they really want to know to help them with that decision making? So we start off with a consideration of what we want our evaluation to do. And then at the end of the process, what we don't want to do is to evaluate and then the outcomes just to sit on a shelf or in a drawer somewhere. We want to make sure that we feed our evaluation back into our delivery. So one of the things we're implementing at Villiers Park is a regular review and reflect cycle. So we bring everyone together, we capture their self-reflections about what they've done over the past 3 months or 6 months. We look at the evaluation data, and as a collective, as a team, we decide what the evaluation data is telling us, and whether, and if so how, we need to change what we do on the basis of that evaluation data. So yeah, this slide is just really to say we've got the kind of core theory of change bit in the middle, but we've bookended it with thinking about stakeholders and thinking about how we can use evaluation to improve our practice. So the key questions, going back to that stakeholder analysis bit and going back to the kind of distinction between managers and practitioners, the key questions are, who are we evaluating for? What do they, or ourselves, if we're the audience, what do we really want to know? What do we expect to get from the evaluation? And I think that the key question really is, how will our evaluation outcomes be used? And I think, those of us that have been doing evaluation from any length of time will have done those quite complicated and, really involved evaluations, got data out the other end, and then found out we can't really use it because it doesn't really tell us things that are practical or that we can feed into practice. So it's kind of starting from the end as well to work out what we want to know and what we want to do, so we can design evaluation to give that to us. Okay, so that's the kind of the main bit. I'm just looking at time. I don't know if we could. So we've got a choice. We can either go into breakout rooms and have a quick chat with each other about our next evaluation projects and who you will be evaluating for and how that might impact on you choose to evaluate, or we can just throw it open to questions, comments and suggestions. I'm kind of looking for Gina for a kind of option 1 or option 2 really. I don't know which you feel would work best.
Shall we be democratic? And if you would like, we can go, if you know how to either put your hand up or you can put in the chat yes. I think if you want breakout rooms, you want to raise your hand. So what that means is going to the reactions and then you can do raise hand, and we can see everybody who would like breakout rooms. So I can see Vicky and Tom would like breakout rooms, and Sarah and Tom. Again, Tom, Alex. Cool. So we've got about 6 people who'd like some breakout rooms. The rest, it seems like, would like to stay in. So about over 20. So my proposal, Julian, is why don't you take a few questions in the plenary, then we'll go into breakout rooms for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back for the next step. So that sound all right?
Yep, that's brilliant. That's
cool.
Great. Yeah.
So back over to everyone then. Thank you so much, Julian. What we'll do now is just stay here. So if you can either raise your hand if you want to contribute something, and then that way Julian will be able to see you and we can go that, or write your question or comment in the chat. And as you're kicking us off with those questions, I think, Julian, one of the things on my mind was, even that everything you mentioned was a tension. You mentioned the tension between using convenience measures, but there must be some benefit for using the convenience measures as and when, right? And so it's always this decision to go through. So I'm really curious from the attendees in the room about some of the live issues or opportunities that you've had, and any questions that you have for Julian. So do you see any comments in the chat? Not yet. And feel free to put your hand up. Over to you.
I'm happy to be argued with if anyone wants to take issue with stuff. I mean, just to say, I really, I love evaluation. I love talking about it. So if things crop, if you think of something after the session, you want to just drop me a message by Twitter or whatever. I'm always very happy to talk evaluation with anyone, whether they really want to or not. So do give me a shout.
Great. So I'll just bring Emily in and then Sarah. So Emily, I'm going to spotlight you first. There you go. If you want to ask your question to Julian.
Thank you. I thought that was a really interesting presentation. Thanks, Julian. So I work in research in the careers space at the moment. So a lot of what you said was really relevant. I've got 2 questions or comments, if that's not too cheeky. One is about the tension between common outcome metrics across different programs versus really focusing in and tailoring your outcomes and your measures to the real specifics of different interventions. And there's pros and cons to both, but I'd just be interested in your experience around that. And the second one is something I've been thinking about in relation to theories of change, which is I'd be really welcome your thoughts on whether you think theories of change are beneficial for organisations or whether you think they're really mainly for programmes and activities.
Thank you. Two excellent questions. In terms of the first question, in terms of the tension between sort of common, consistent benchmarks across a sector and individual, or very tailored outcomes, yeah, it's a kind of pragmatic choice, isn't it? It's kind of why you're evaluating. I suppose in terms of particularly the world I worked in before, which was outreach for higher education, I sort of became a little bit frustrated with the approach that we needed consistent and benchmarkable measures, because I don't think the measures we worked particularly well, the measures we had available didn't work particularly well. And I think if you've got measures that are clearly relevant and clearly related to what you're trying to achieve, then yeah, consistent and coherent measures across a broad range is brilliant. But I think if I can only talk about the sectors I've been involved in, but I think that's probably the biggest weakness for us as evaluators, is that we don't always use effective and appropriate measures, which means that our evaluation isn't as good as it should be, which is, I suppose, why, I kind of got to that point, oh no, I'm just going to have to, do very specific evaluations where I've got complete control over the measures and I understand how they relate to what we do. But I can also see that if you're involved in a kind of a bigger kind of perspective, or you've got a bigger perspective, that doesn't help you kind of move the sector on either. So that was kind of my politician's fudging answer. I'm on both sides, they're both good, I think. And in terms of theory of change, you asked whether it was applicable to kind of programs or whole organizations. I am probably a bit obsessed with theory of change. I love it, and I think you can use it for everything. So I do, again, having worked in some large organizations, I sometimes have been a bit frustrated with the kind of thinking that happens, and I sort of see missed opportunities for kind of more complex thinking when decisions are being made. And to me, theory of change can really help with that, because it's a much more structured and kind of exploded way of thinking that asks you to challenge your assumptions and to actually investigate, the validity of what you want to do. So yeah, I use it when I'm deciding what to have for tea sometimes. But as I said, I'm probably a bit. So does that kind of?
Thank you. No, they're really helpful reflections. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Emily. So Sarah, do you want to go ahead and ask your question, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, briefly, I'm also a massive theory of change fan, so it's great to hear exactly what you just said. Then speaks to my heart. So I suppose my question is aligned to Emily's first question, and it's around how you deal with the fact that schools, in particular, we are talking about education change here, and there's a massive complexity and lots of different things happening at the same time. So isolating the impact that you have without reducing it to nothing, and I wondered how you deal with that, like the confounding factors.
Yeah, I think that's why the kind of small steps approach spoke particularly to me. And I'd sort of started thinking, and Neil and Richard, Neil Hazard and Richard Waller kind of articulated it beautifully. And it was kind of a dissatisfaction with the kind of evaluation we were doing. So when I started looking at access to HE type of interventions, we were measuring the success of an intervention by whether someone 3 or 4 years down the line went to university or not. And as you said, there's a kind of young people are completely different from each other, so you can't homogenize them. They're all in different contexts. There's all this other different stuff going on for them, and I just sort of lost faith in the fact that we could really attach any kind of causal impact from the intervention that we might have done. So the kind of small steps approach seemed to me to be a really good way of stepping back and actually looking at the intervention on its own terms and assessing it on its own terms, rather than trying to assess it for things that are far removed. So I sort of hope that through that approach we can be much more confident about making causal claims about the impact that we've had, And my dream, particularly, in the kind of world of HE-based outreach, is that enough people will do enough small steps approach that we'll be able to stick them together. I always think of the blockbuster board, all these kind of interlocking small steps, and we'll say, actually, you know what, there is a solid pathway. Different young people might take different pathways, but all these things do interrelate, and they do create the outcome we want in the end. That's my dream. One day.
Cool. Thanks so much, Sarah, for a great question. I just wrote in the chat. It's really fascinating because for those who attended last week's session from the EEF, where we had Christine and Jamila, did anybody attend that one who's on the call right now?
I wanted to, but I missed it, so would welcome.
And I don't see any other hands that have you in gallery, but I would definitely rewatch that because it's very fascinating to balance it, Julian, with what you're saying, where that is all about causation and obviously using the RCTs for that. That's definitely not a small steps way. And so actually the influence and the power of small steps when used by different organizations to have a variety of ways to do this. And there's not necessarily the right way. There's not a one size fits all way. In the same way, Julian, that you said, we all get on the trend and we're like, oh yeah, this works, let's all do it. So I think really fascinating as a comparison for that to look at the causal. So what I suggest we do is we're gonna do 2 30-second questions, Julian. We're gonna do rapid fire for you before you're off. So the first question for you is from Heather, which we've got, how do you bring other stakeholders on board? So getting managers and trustees to view evaluation in a slightly different, a more complex or varied way. How have you done this in your own organizations? It is for everybody. So Annie, thank you so much. I think you have responded, but Julian, do you have a 30-second answer for that? And then we'll go on to Tom's question before closing up.
Yeah, I am lucky enough at Villiers Park to be working in an organisation that is completely down with all this stuff. So I'm in a very conducive environment, but I have worked in other contexts where this kind of approach was against the grain, and the way that we overcame that was we started small and we started outputting evaluations in this mold, and people began to see the sense and they began to see how they worked, and they gradually built up trust that this would give them what they wanted as well.
Cool, thank you so much, Julian. And last, Tom, 10-second question.
Okay, I'll try. So yeah, it was a quick one, Julian, about sort of the challenge. It's a bit more a practical question around kind of completion rates. So we have an issue often where we only get sort of 25% completion on surveys and data and things like that. And often they're the most keen people, which again slightly skews the data. So I just wondered if you had any kind of experience of doing sort of embedded workshop surveys or things like that, practical ways to get completion rate on evaluation closer to that elusive 100% mark.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. 25% is not bad. We always think 25-30% is pretty good, and you're right, there is a bias, isn't there, because we get in the keen students. So some of the ways we go around that is to adopt a kind of, I think at the beginning we were talking about sort of triangulation, and to adopt, to look at different evaluation approaches to gather evidence, and also to probably give up on the idea that we're going to have 100% robust causal evidence. I'm a lot more pragmatic now than I was when I started, and I'm thinking if I've got a steer that I can be really reasonably confident in, that's probably as much as I can hope for at this point. Hopefully the more steers we get, the more collectively we'll build that stronger picture. But I'm completely aware of my limitations.
Great, thanks.
Great. And on that note, we want to ensure we have a good completion rate as well. So we're going to wrap up and say a huge thanks to Julian in a second. But if we can get your feedback, Ellie's going to launch a poll. So our theory of change is that the Impact Festival will support you as attendees with the knowledge, skills, and networks to have long-term change in the ecosystem. If you wouldn't mind filling in your thoughts to these 4 questions, I'll tell a bit about our longer term evaluation and how we'd love some of you to form a focus group and case studies so we can triangulate this. But in the meantime, love to get your thoughts. Thanks who are doing that. Fantastic. Give another minute or so. And Ellie, thanks for putting that in the chat. We'll just follow up on that in a second. Great. So thank you so much. If I can ask everybody to come off mute and give Julian a massive round of applause. Thank you. I think you have named so many of the tensions that we all face in the work and the different stakeholder groups that we are managing and expectations as a result of it. But really what's come through is a need and the continued purpose of putting impact at the heart of what we do. Ultimately, the strategy is impact. And so if that's embedded within the organization and you recognize the tensions, how you might be able to manage those differently. So you've said to get in touch with you on Twitter. Is that right, Julian, the best way? Okay, fantastic. So for those wanting to continue the conversation with Julian, get in touch on Twitter. And Ellie has also put in the chat the list of the attendees. So have a look at that and feel free to connect with one another so you can continue these. Apologies, we didn't get to go into the breakout rooms, but I think it was a really insightful questions that you shared at the last 5 or so minutes, and glad that we had the chance to hear from Julian on it. So hopefully you can join our sessions tomorrow on tackling racial justice head on. There's a session on impact measurement for any early stage organizations led by Caitlin at Big Change, would be fantastic. We've got pop dance workout with me and my mom joining from California on Wednesday. So a variety of sessions over the course of the next 3 days for you to connect with one another, develop the skills and knowledge and networks to continue your work in making education fair. So thank you so much, everybody. Wishing you a lovely Monday night. And if you have any feedback, do feel free to send it to fea.events@faireducation.org.uk. In the meantime, otherwise you'll get a survey from us on Friday as well. So thanks, Julian, for a fantastic session, and look forward to seeing you all later on this week.
Thank you, everyone.